Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games, and today I wanted to talk about history and RPGs. It's a pretty broad topic, and I'll probably cover a lot of ground if I can. I may ramble a little bit. It's a subject that's of particular interest to me, and while I'll certainly be, putting forward pretty clearly my thoughts on the subject, I don't want others to feel like they have to agree with me. If you disagree, certainly put in a comment. I tend not to reply just because I don't want to create a sense that I'm debating with people in the comments. I want people to feel comfortable voicing their opinions without worrying about me coming in and saying something back. If I have something pertinent to add, I might, but I'll generally try to keep it to fairly complimentary posts. I won't get mad if you disagree with me or anything. I know a lot of people feel strongly about history and its role in gaming. So by all means, just voice your opinion. Um, so yeah, so I studied history. It was I'm not an expert. I don't ever want people to think that I'm presenting myself as that. I merely had an undergrad degree in history, and I don't think that really gave me uh, the same level of knowledge that say someone who's gone through the master's program or as a PhD or currently teaches history at either the high school level or at the college level or has written books on the subject. I consider myself just a history buff. I like history. I think I have a lot of gaps in my historical knowledge. There are areas where I'm constantly trying to grow and learn more, and I'm always interested in it. But I don't think that I'm uh, at all in a position to write a history book. And so when I write an RPG that's based in history, I want that to be pretty clear. This is I'm somebody who likes history. I enjoy using it in my games, but I don't feel like our product should be used as historical reference books. I just don't. I'm pretty uncomfortable in general with the idea of using RPG books as historical sources. There are a couple that are pretty well done, I think. Don't get me wrong. And I once had when I was taking my course in the Byzantine Empire, we had a professor who was a gamer, and he used to bring in the little Osprey books, and he would go on about how he felt a lot of those books were pretty good starting points for and pretty well researched. So again, I don't think that you can't mix the two, but I think you have to be very careful about. Somebody mentioned this term to me the other day. I think they called it edutainment. So sort of mixing education and entertainment together, and there's number one, there's always a compromise, but number two, I'm more of a creative person. I'm not a history professor. I'm not someone who can, I have some basic training in it. I could certainly probably make a very good intern at a historical museum, no problem. But I don't think that I'm equipped to instruct people on the complexities of ancient Rome in a way that goes beyond what you might need for an RPG. And even then, I would certainly point people to better sources than myself. I think any game, if you're going to do history, you certainly want to research it, and you got to, strive for accuracy if that's the kind of book you're trying to make. But I just always like to, emphasize this with people that like for example, we have a game which I mentioned in my last video post, Servants of Gaius, and it's based in ancient Rome, and I worked really hard on the research, but again, when I studied history, I did not study Latin. I did not study. I studied a lot of Mediterranean history, but my like when you learn history, you have to pick a language, and my language was Arabic, and I'm not really that good at Arabic. I can't really speak it. I can kind of read it. I can make some use of it, and if I have some text and I have a Hansware dictionary, I can slowly make some progress reading things, but I'm not at all someone who could just go to an Arabic country and start talking to people and conversing freely. Um, it was a I took it for about 2 years, so that's and with you know with stuff like ancient Rome. I've always had an interest in ancient Rome. My mom's side of the family is Italian, and I think with that comes a certain level of interest in it. I always had cousins that were, you know, were into that stuff and would talk about it. So I think, you know, when I made Servants of Gaius, I certainly used what tools I had to make it accurate. I consulted with people who knew more than I did to make it as accurate as I could, but I would never, you know, use it as a source for, say, like a paper or something. I don't think it's and I wouldn't rely upon it for anything but your needs at the table. Do you know what I mean? I think we did some exceptional things with it, but but at the end of the day, I'm just a guy making, you know, games with dice, and I really, you know, there were no, you know, as much as I've edited, as much as I did what I could to prevent errors. I know that there are simplifications in there, that there are mistakes in there. I know that that just the fact that you have to, sometimes you need an answer for something, so you have to either make something up, or you have to simplify or come to a conclusion about something that's actively debated and not necessarily as clear cut as an RPG rulebook would make it. We also did another game which I think was pretty good in terms of the history. That was Arrows of Indra. I didn't write this. This was an RPG pundit book, but I thought that the history was pretty well done in here. And you know, again, it's but these are games. These are games, and I think even if you have a you know, I mean, I suppose there would be a case where, like, I know that there was a Rome game put out not too long ago, and I think they actually hired a professor to do it. And in a case like that, maybe there's a, you know, you could certainly make an argument that if it's a person writing within their specialty, you're gonna have it's just going to probably be more accurate. But again, you're still just getting one specialist's point of view. You're not reading every major work in the subject. But it was, I'm sure it was impressive. I didn't have a chance to play it. I believe it was the Weird Wars Rome game for Savage Worlds. It's actually one that I've been meaning to try. But I'm sure if they hired a specialist in Roman history, it's probably one of the better ones out there. Again, I can't say because I haven't read it yet. I haven't played it yet. It's on my list, but I got a big backlog of stuff. So, but just in general, I just think the RPG medium is very different from, you know, from the history book medium. You know, there's a lot of ongoing conversations in history. There's a lot of you know, things that would be important to an RPG player, to a game master or a player. They're not as important to historians, or they're asking other questions. So oftentimes when you're doing research for a game, you know, again, like we just did Wandering Heroes of Ogregate, and again, my special, like when I studied history, China was I took some courses in that, but it was not my area of focus. I had an interest in it, but I wouldn't, you know, again, I wouldn't bill myself as somebody who's exceptionally knowledgeable about it. But when we did, I had to go and research, you know, a lot and go back to the history, dig out some of my textbooks, you know, amass some more, and one of the things you find when you're making a game where you're drawing on the history is there are some questions that are very sort of basic things you need to know for the purposes of running a game that are really hard to find in history books. They're either not addressed, or like it might be addressed in one particular book that you might have trouble acquiring, or, you know, worst case scenario, like, you know, and this happened, I found a lot with both Rome and my Chinese history stuff that I was researching. It's in a language you don't understand. So in the case of China, you know, obviously a lot of history's been written by people in Mandarin and Cantonese, and I don't speak any of those languages. So if it's written by a Chinese historian and it's not been translated into English, then it's going to be really, really tough for me to get my hands on. The same with Rome. There was a lot of stuff either written in Italian or stuff that was in the original Latin that wasn't translated, and there's only so much I could do with that. If when I've done stuff for games set in America, that's much easier because I live in Massachusetts. Again, I didn't study American history. I studied mainly like Mediterranean and Middle Eastern and European history. But uh, but if it's set in the States, like if I was doing like a colonial Gothic campaign or something, I can just go to like a local, like every town around here has museums and they have, documents and all kinds of things, logs from old merchants, all this stuff, town annals. There's all kinds of things that you can find in English that are perfectly easy to understand that can answer a lot of your questions. And if that doesn't, then I can just go to one of these museums and ask one of the curators questions. It's pretty, it's much more straightforward. But yeah, so I think, but in general, even then, I think there's still things that gamers care about that just, historians just tend not to address. Sometimes they'll be addressed in social history. They'll come up in in books that sort of try to deal with more the ground level view of things. So if you're dealing like the one of the things that prompted me to talk about this was Fernand Burdell came up in a forum conversation I was involved in, and he has a 3-volume work called Civilization and Capitalism, and it's about 15th and 18th century society. But the first volume is the structures of everyday life, and it's pretty thick, and it gets into some real minutia about daily living. So just as an example, there's a chapter in here on sugar. There's a chapter in here on bread. All sorts of things. And I think the next volume in the series is about markets and towns. So and then the final book is about sort of the economic system of capitalism. So it's a very big book, but there are social histories like that. Another there's also things called micro histories where they focus on a particular, like a really small area or an individual, and we'll give you a history of like maybe an event or something that happened. So I know there's the Cheese and the Worms is a really famous one about a guy who was charged with heresy for his beliefs about how the world was formed in Italy. And when you read those, you can sometimes get real ground level views of what life might have been like. I know in that book they talk a lot. If I remember, they talk about milling, and so you get a lot of details about what maybe a miller's life might have been like. So you get that, but again, in the Wandering Heroes of Ogregate game, government institutions are a big deal, obviously, because it's Imperial China, and it got really tricky, sort of finding out, okay, how does this bureaucratic system actually work? Because when you're mapping out an area or a community or NPCs, you got to figure out where they fit into the society. So I ended up finding this one, which helped a lot, which was just a dictionary of official titles in Imperial China. And my understanding is this has a lot of problems. There are definitely some issues, but as you can see, it's just literally, titles with the definition of what they mean. And I'm sure if somebody knew Chinese, they'd have a much easier time because this is, a lot of times the characters are pronounced somewhat similarly, but they mean something different if there's a different tone. And so, that book, there were a lot of titles that to me looked like the same title, but apparently they were two very different names. And you only know that if you know the Chinese characters, and or if you at least understand they have diacritical marks to indicate tone, but I find those just go right over my head, just because tone isn't something that I think about on a daily basis. So I think with games, and again, I'm sorry to ramble. This is a subject that I like, but I think with RPGs, it's a much bigger challenge to do I've had a harder time researching RPG material in history than I did as a student. I think it's because you need to know, okay, well, what kind of stone did they use for this, or okay, how did they extract salt from the salt wells? What were the oh geez, what exactly does an astronomical clock do? What is its purpose? Why, where would they have been located in town? Who would have had access to them? You have all these questions that might not come up as much in a regular history book, especially if it's a book that's covering a lot of ground. I find I usually end up with just a pile of books that I slowly work my way through, and by the end, I think I usually get pretty, I get pretty comfortable with running a game, but I wouldn't want to give a lecture on it. Do you know what I mean? I think sometimes when you're doing this, you can fool yourself into thinking you know more than you do. And one thing I've found with history, especially, and I noticed this among when I was a student, I noticed this with history professors. The ones who are the smartest were always the ones that seem to be the most likely to say I don't know when you ask them a question. The ones who didn't say that, they were either geniuses, and you would go and you would check and they'd be right, which was very rare, or there were people who were afraid to look like they didn't know something. And I think it's one of those things in history where when you realize you don't know something, that's actually the moment when you can learn. So it's actually really important, I think, to not feel like you always got to show that you know everything. Like there's a lot of stuff. Like I've read a lot about, for example, I've read a lot about class in Chinese history, like social class and hierarchies. But there's a lot of questions I still have about it, and I'm still constantly combing through to make sure I get a deeper understanding. And over time, it improves, or new information comes to light where it's more complicated than I thought it might have been, and that happens more often than I'd like. But that's the nature of history, I guess. But yeah, I think that's it's good to be humble about it, to not feel like you're you gotta constantly show off, and it's meant to be, for me, history is something that's meant to be enjoyable, not painful. So why use it as like a front for showing people how great you are, I guess, or showing people how much you know. I've read it for years, and I still feel like an acolyte. I don't feel like I always have more questions than answers when it comes to history, and I'm constantly forgetting things. I read a ton of stuff on ancient Rome from maybe 2000 to 2010. Like I just went through a decade where I was just super into Rome, and I knew all the emperors. I knew as much as I could about the social structure. But then, I let a few years go by where I wasn't reading it as regularly, and I started to forget things. I certainly couldn't recite the emperors anymore. I definitely would need to brush up on some of the social structures if I were to run a Servants of Gaius campaign right now. I just think that's sort of, if you don't use it, you lose it, is sort of the saying, and I think that's true in history. So again, I think I love history. Even in Sartorius, when we did that was kind of an excuse for me to go and read up on like ancient libraries and stuff like that. If you look at the blog, I have a bunch of entries in there on book production in the ancient world and things like that, and how scrolls were put together, and those sort of things interest me. But I don't think any of that. I would be very reluctant, as much as there's been sort of an interplay for me with my entertainment helping get me interested in things like history. I think you have to be very careful. You don't want to be one of those people that gets like all their, like, you don't want to be the guy that gets all his scientific knowledge from Star Trek. You don't want to be the guy who gets all his history knowledge from D&D or from whatever. I mean, it can be a great vehicle for it, but I think it can also set you up for a lot of heartache if you rely on that as your source of knowledge, or if you rely on like a limited number of sources, or if you just can't acknowledge where it is you might be you know, not as not as strong in the subject as you think. So, all right, my phone is ringing, so I think that means it's time for me to go, and I've talked for long enough. I will. I will leave it at that. This is probably going to be like a 20-minute video blog, and I'm sure I pissed off a lot of people because I rambled about history, and I don't even remember what I said now. So if you disagreed with me, certainly comment. I promise I will not argue with you. I will let you say whatever you feel, and no, I'm not gonna react. If I feel like I can comment and compliment what you're saying, I will reply. But I don't want to flame more people in my comments section. So if you disagree, feel free to disagree with me. And other than that, I'll probably do a video in the coming days on wuxia again. I want to talk about some of my favorite movies, and I don't know if it's going to be sort of like these are great movies and shows for running dungeons, or if I'm just going to kind of do a rundown of the things that influenced Wandering Heroes of Ogregate, the things that were particularly influential. So I'll probably get that out maybe tomorrow or the next day. But yeah, so all right, bye.